It's very timely to consider the United Nations protocols on limiting emissions, given the coming to the end of the Kyoto Protocol and moving into the final stages of negotiations in Paris. It is also therefore timely to reflect, perhaps you could reflect for us, on what has happened with Kyoto.
Yeah, Kyoto Protocol agreed in 1997, obviously in Kyoto was a very much a turning point in international climate negotiations. And I suppose the EU likes to reflect itself on international negotiations. And what we saw in Kyoto was very much a kind of a top-down legalistic approach to international climate negotiations. And so essentially what we had was an overall target kind of agreed, and then that target was apportioned between the different participants. And of course, then we had the division between Annex 1 countries and Annex 2 countries, so developed countries and developing countries. And developed countries were given the responsibility to reduce emissions, and developing countries were effectively parties to the protocol but had no legally binding targets. And so lessons from the Kyoto Protocol, I would say one of the key lessons is that this legalistic type of approach, kind of top-down imposition of targets on other players is, while it might be, we'll say, robust in terms of the pressure it puts on various countries to take climate action, what it risks is pushing people out of the agreement. So by being robust, it becomes less inclusive, which I suppose is obvious in a way. But what we've seen from the Kyoto Protocol was, first of all, the United States never ratified the treaty, and the US Senate is very seldom unanimous on any topic, but we found that it rejected the Kyoto Protocol unanimously, rejected ratification unanimously, and using the pretext that some developing countries weren't covered by the Kyoto Protocol. And then the second thing we found was that even if there were legally binding targets on countries, when countries like Canada subsequently didn't meet their objectives, and there was no chance that they were going to meet their objectives, they merely withdrew from the treaty. And there was no, although if you stayed within the treaty, you could be punished because it was a legally binding international treaty, you know, there was nothing to stop Canada from withdrawing from the treaty. So really, I suppose, for me, the key lesson is that this kind of legalistic, top-down kind of approach, while effective and very attractive, we'll say, from an environmental protection perspective, can have certain limitations and weaknesses. And in particular, if you're asking countries to do something that they feel politically or technically unable or unwilling to do for whatever reason, that they will find ways to kind of get around it and to get out of that sort of legal kind of framework. I think just very briefly, the second thing from Kyoto is that this division between developing and developed countries, it no longer has any real place in terms of the way the global economy has developed. You know, China is responsible for over a quarter of total greenhouse gas emissions now. The EU is only responsible for 10% roughly of global emissions. Whereas back in, you know, the mid-90s, this focus exclusively on developed countries made a huge amount of sense. It's becoming less and less sustainable that if we want to have an environmentally effective treaty, we really need to include all players. Those are some maybe negatives, but would it be worth saying something about the positives before we move on with you know?
Yes, that's
and
Thank you.
And I think that, you know, there's been a huge amount of criticism of the Kyoto Protocol for some of the reasons I mentioned. But I think it's important to remember how profoundly important Kyoto has been, particularly within the EU. So once the EU had agreed its Kyoto Treaty Agreement, it came back and effectively legalized the Kyoto Protocol within the EU legal framework. And so what that means is, since Kyoto, all member states have had legally binding emissions reduction targets. And this has undoubtedly led to a huge amount of institutional and technological development, but the institutional changes have been required. For example, in Ireland, you mentioned I've been appointed to Ireland's National Advisory Council on Climate Change, but to take Ireland as one example, and we could go through every single EU country and we would see the same thing. So in 2000, Ireland had its first national climate change strategy. You could argue that large parts of it weren't implemented, but at least we had, all of a sudden, we had a very serious focus on climate change. In 2007, we had our second national climate change strategy. In fact, the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland was established effectively in 2009, which was again a consequence of the Kyoto Protocol. There was just, a huge amount of institutional rearrangement in Ireland and a lot of thinking in all EU countries about how we were to meet our climate change objectives. And this has, again, undoubtedly led to a huge amount of technological development. I would say in particular, Germany, in terms of trying to meet its Kyoto commitments, has put a lot of pressure for technological innovation and development. And the major breakthroughs we've seen for solar PV in particular, but also wind energy, and the huge cost reductions in those technologies which have arisen are all in some way related to this kind of international kind of top-down pressure. And so when we go to assess the Kyoto Protocol, I think it's easy to say, oh, well, look, it's obviously had no impact. It only covers a very small portion of overall global emissions. And even those countries, many of them have withdrawn or they haven't met their targets or whatever. And it's easy to be overly negative, but I think, we also need to look at the positive, and there has absolutely definitely been, a positive raising of political awareness of climate change as an issue which arose from the Kyoto Protocol. And this has also undoubtedly, in my view, led to a lot of technological developments, technological innovation, and has driven the development of low carbon technologies.